Welcome to another episode of Messed Up People. Today we're going to talk about loneliness. And as you can imagine, there's probably a lot of that going on right now with this COVID-19 epidemic. But loneliness has always been an issue that we as humans have dealt with. In fact, the last few years there have been plenty of studies. You look at the British Red Cross. They did a study on United Kingdom, and they found that 1 in 5 of the population suffer from loneliness. There are different organizations such as Harvard University or the New York Times and many others who have classified loneliness as an epidemic. And several studies have found that loneliness is a key factor to early death, pretty much on par with smoking, obesity, and different harmful activities. Loneliness is a problem. And chances are there are many of you watching this right now who are experiencing loneliness. Loneliness can affect the way we live. It can affect how we interact with people. It can affect our relationship with God. And loneliness comes on from different sources. Deaths in the family, traumatic situations that happen to you during your lifetime and during your childhood. Life changes such as college, married, children, whatever it may be. Different economic standings, whether you're rich or whether you're poor, mental health issues, sin, the list goes on and on. There are different areas of life that can affect how we feel in regards to our relationships with others and make us feel lonely. But many watching this have probably felt lonely at least once in their life, if not everyone has. But there are many who are watching this who have always felt this phenomenon of loneliness. Well, what does the Bible have to say about this? Were there people in the Bible who felt lonely that God used for good? If we look at the Bible, we're going to find plenty of examples. You think about David, you think about Elijah, Noah, Abraham, you think about Hannah, and even a man named Jesus. All of these people dealt with loneliness, and God used them for good things, for good to be the outcome of their situation. And the sad thing about loneliness, it can create this idea that you are rejected by quote-unquote normal people and kind of removed from society and put in your own situation, away from the society and the world around you. Loneliness can be detrimental, but we can use it for good, and God can use it for good if we allow Him to. Now, like I said, there are plenty of examples we can look at, but there is one example. It's one of my favorite Old Testament stories, and that's found in 2 Kings chapter 7. So we're going to read that, 2 Kings chapter 7, and starting in verse 3. Now there were 4 men with leprosy at the entrance of the city gate. They said to each other, "Why stay here until we die? If we say we'll go into the city, the famine is there, and we will die. And if we stay here, we will die. So let's go over to the camp of the Arameans and surrender. If they spare us, we will live. If they kill us, then we die." At dusk they got up and went to the camp of the Arameans. When they reached the edge of the camp, no one was there, for the Lord had caused the Arameans to hear the sound of chariots and horses and a great army, so that they said to one another, "Look, the king of Israel has hired the Hittite and the Egyptian kings to attack us." So they got up and fled in the dusk and abandoned their tents and their horses and donkeys. They left the camp as it was and ran for their lives. The men who had leprosy reached the edge of the camp, entered one of the tents, and ate and drank. Then they took silver and gold and clothes and went off and hid them. They returned and entered another tent and took some things from it and hid them also. Then they said to each other, "What we're doing is not right. This is a day of good news, and we are keeping it to ourselves. If we wait until daylight, punishment will overtake us. Let us go at once and report to the royal palace." Now, from this story of these 4 lepers, we find lessons about loneliness that can hopefully help us out. So let's look at these. Number 1, loneliness can bring on desperation. You see, these 4 leprous men, and leprosy was a disease of the skin, rotting and decaying skin. And these 4 men were secluded outside the city. And this was an ordinance of God. God told them that the children of Israel, if there are lepers in your midst, make them go outside the camp in order to protect the rest of the people. Kind of like what we're doing with COVID-19. If you are infected, you need to go in quarantine. Well, that's what these people were doing. They were secluded, but that can, as you can imagine, bring on loneliness. They were out there and a war was going on, and they were hungry and they were starving. They realized they were in desperation. If we go inside the city, we're going to die. If we stay here, we're going to die. If we go to the Arameans, there's a chance we could die, but that's where we're going to go, because there might be a small chance that we may live. But it brings on desperation. And desperation can actually be a good thing or a bad thing. Desperation can make us do things that are negative, that can hurt us. But desperation can also do things that are good for us. Loneliness can bring on desperation. It's up to us whether we bring on the good or the bad, whether we seek for life or whether we seek for further heartache. And these men went after something great. They went after life. We can do the same. Loneliness can bring on desperation to push us closer to Jesus. Is that what you're going through right now? Are you seeking to draw closer to Jesus? If you're experiencing loneliness right now, I encourage you, find the one individual that can make you whole. Loneliness can bring on desperation. It can push us closer to Jesus. But number 2, loneliness can bring us closer to life. And we find that life in Jesus. And these men found this life in the camp of the Arameans. They ate, they fed themselves, they clothed themselves, and they brought on life. If we search for Jesus as treasure, if we seek him, Jesus says that we will find him. Loneliness can bring on life. But loneliness, number 3, is not an excuse. Loneliness is not an excuse. These men realized they had something great and it needed to be shared. And they said, what are we doing? What we're doing is not right. This is a day of good news, and we are keeping it to ourselves. If we wait until daylight, punishment will overtake us. Let's go at once and report this to the royal palace. This is a day of good news. They had good news on their side, that they had food, they had clothing, and they couldn't hold back and keep it to themselves. They needed to share it with the world around them. They needed to share it with their brothers and sisters back in the city. Sometimes loneliness can bring on bitterness. And if we're not careful, when we find a good thing, we can hoard that good thing to ourselves. It's the same with Jesus. We're lonely and we're discouraged, and so we find goodness in Jesus, but we decide not to share that with anybody else because we're bitter. We would just want to build up our relationship with Jesus. But loneliness is no excuse. God still wants us to do good in this world, even if we're lonely. God still wants us to do good to those people who might have even kicked us out of the city. That's what these lepers did. They brought the good news to the city around them. But fourth, loneliness doesn't mean we're alone. And we need to remember that. When you're in a lonely state, sometimes you can feel all alone, but that's not the case. These men realized that they had a problem, leprosy, and they were outside the camp and they were alone, but they found something good, and they realized that there were thousands of people back in the city that had a different problem. They weren't alone in their problems. We're not alone in our problems. We may be discouraged by loneliness from time to time, but there are 1 in every 5 people who suffer from this daily. And there are plenty more who suffer with different sins, sins of addiction, people struggling with mental health issues, sins, so many different sins we could describe, but we're all in this together. We are not alone in this life of heartache. So we need to remember that in our time of loneliness, when we feel like we are all alone, we're not alone. Someone else is there struggling with the same issue, and many more are struggling with some that we would never dream of. We're not alone in this. And we need to remember that. And if we keep that in our mind, it's going to help us with our last lesson we learn here. That loneliness gives us a better perspective of God's compassion. You see, these people And these men, they went out of the city, and they were full of this disease of the skin, and they were hungry and famished, and they found life out there in the camp of the Arameans. And as they looked back into the city, they had compassion for those souls. Loneliness can point us towards greater compassion. Again, if we allow it. We can see people in a different light if we choose to do so. But we need to seek it. As we see from all of this, loneliness is really about perspective and how we react to it. We can either react to it by getting further deep down into that state of loneliness and depression, or we can pick ourselves up and help those around us. We can be like these people that even though they were the outcast of society, God used them to save an entire city. What can God do with you? No matter how lonely you may feel right now, God can use you for good. We are all messed up people, but God can use us if we allow Him to do great things.